Nebulized Studios presents Kagou, a Colossus Clash Tale, 15 years before Catalyst. Written and narrated by Anthony Treadway. Additional voices by Cecil Bowen. As Toby painfully awoke and mentally stumbled through the thick fog behind his eyes, he affiliated his general discomfort with the earlier mass consumption of whiskey. He terribly wanted to drown his frustration and forget missing the shot on a 12-foot prize catch, but irritation sparked consciousness as he remembered the booze and embarrassment of the lost gator. After a moment of clawing through his daze, Toby began to feel the pressure behind his eyes competing with the pressure being forced upon them. A blindfold, tied on his eyelids, had its knot digging sharply into the back of his head. The urge to remove the eye cover was restricted, delivering the horrifying news that his limbs were bound. After a meager squirm, panic struck, and Toby began to flail. Due to being hogtied, Toby's shoulders and knees produced low, reverberating thuds against the wood underneath. He attempted to scream, but his cries were muted by a wad of cloth reeking of a fishy odor. Adrenaline cut through the murkiness of his mind, and after a few moments of floundering, Toby sensed a familiarity. He was lying in the belly of a longboat. He knew this on an account of the residual sway his fit had induced. This small bit of knowledge sobered him enough to utilize the 1 out of 5 unimpeded senses he had available to him. He paused all movements to carefully listen. Ignoring his bonds and sweat-soaked shirt, both clingy, pulling at him from odd angles, he discerned that the boat was traveling within the bayou. He was well acquainted with the arcane bass of gator growls vibrating through the humid air. Piecing together his environment introduced a brief shard of lucidity, some fleeting respite before it was shattered by a deep, scratchy voice carrying a native Cajun accent.
You finally realizing we in the water?
Toby froze. He did not recognize the voice. Anticipating more, he waited for the man to speak again, but was only answered by the pulsing rhythm of croaks and chirps. The wet whisper of an oar provoked Toby to frantically work to free his arms. Knowing his captor or captors were watching him helplessly struggle made him unnerved. He felt naked and inept while writhing against the coarse rope binding his limbs, and soon felt the burn of his restraints twisting on tender wrists. The pain ushered fear to rise against his chest. The emptiness in his stomach combined with the fluttering behind his sternum forced an unintelligible scream into the filthy gag. Toby could feel the panic swallowing him, but just before it sent him reeling, the voice presented a question, allowing him to grasp to sanity.
Do you think Milo was that afraid?
Toby didn't know a Milo. He tried to tongue the gag out of his mouth, desperate to communicate clearly, but it didn't budge. With a whimper, he trilled out, "Who?" The voice released a contemplative and graveled sigh. Toby fought back his sobs while hoping his captor understood the question and would answer. After 2 measured whimpers, he received a reply twisted with ire and grief.
I guess you wouldn't be knowing the name of a Negro boy you let get eat. We all just gator bait to you.
The gravity of realization plunged into the core of Toby, stiffening him with a dense chill. Wading through a wave of cold sweat, he choked out frantic pleas heard only as raspy moans. The unknown voice spoke over them, projected with exasperation.
No use in fighting. We done known it was you and your brother.
A snared Toby fell limp, submitting to despair, letting himself cry deeply. He attempted to squeak out, "I'm sorry." However, the rag in his mouth caused any dialogue to sound synonymous with his wailing. Long moments passed, filled with the soft splash of the oar and Toby's howling. Soon, his dejection gave way to a rage, which he used to fight the ropes again. Rejecting the pain of his restraints biting into now raw wrists, Toby decided he was going to flip the boat. He would plunge his captor into the same waters where he assumed he was going to be poetically fed. A person of his standing wasn't going to be brought to an end by some backwater Cajun. His furor emitted seething screams as he invested all his strength into throwing his body against the side of the wooden craft, only with his efforts to be violently snapped short. His new position allowed his right pinky to find the culprit of his pathetic lurch. Sturdy, perspiring metal. An iron ring bolted to the belly of the vessel where his bonds were looped squelched his revolt. Toby bellowed with frustration. He was becoming manic, teetering between despondent and furious.
Don't worry, you won't suffer the same fate as poor old Milo.
There was a gentle pat on Toby's knee. Repulsed, he attempted to kick at his captor's hand.
You gonna be fed to the coachman.
Toby wasn't fluent in Creole, but he knew enough to recognize Coachma. It meant nightmare. If the intention was to frighten him, it didn't. His anger was currently only fueling him to find a means of escape. Compiling the splinters of his situation logically brought Toby to understand a fight on the water was idiotic. Hopefully, whatever or whoever this Coachma was, it was on land. He decided if that were the case, he needed to save his energy for the moment he would be hauled out. However, calming his breath and mind diluted his outrage and allowed horror to poison his composure, and innately, his exhales began to tremble.
I don't like this either.
Toby focused on the voice, grasping at anything to occupy his mind and abate the creeping terror.
You kept taking our future.
The voice was laden with sadness.
Can't keep taking the little ones and expect us to do nothing.
There was a hint of confusion in the now cracking voice.
You're ripping away what's teaching love, what's giving hope.
Toby wanted to hear nothing more from his captor. The bullet that missed the target had more value than the bait. His indifference hardened his resolve to fight.
My grandson was deserving more life.
There was a short period of only hushed sniffles and the song of the swamp until the voice took in a long breath and cleared his throat. Toby was disgusted with the thought of his captor's suppressed weeping.
This won't solve nothing.
The voice had dropped an octave and became cold.
Temporary tourniquet is all. Gotta stop the bleeding somehow, I reckon.
After several light splashes of the oar, Toby sensed their speed pick up. The strokes were becoming heavier, occasionally making a sucking sound as the row was pulled from the water. A sharp whistle beckoned the rower, and Toby soon felt the gentle grind of wet earth underneath them before being jerked around by the longboat's land.
All right, Wody. It's that time.
The hollow clatter of an oar being set beside Toby announced the final chapter of their stint together. The clunking of his captor exiting the boat signaled Toby to prepare for his opening. He heard a second, younger voice quietly muttering. Toby assumed this was who the whistle came from. While trying to interpret the hushed communication, he was startled when the older voice responded from what sounded like 2 feet away.
You want the feet?
The question was answered by someone handling the rope at his hands, and soon the pull between his feet and wrists loosened. His ankles were still bound, but he could now straighten his legs. Were they going to further cut his bonds? Mania instantly took hold as he realized he never had a chance at escaping. Just hubris and anger painting a delusion. Toby was going to die. With the ability to bend his knees, he wormed violently as weeping set in. A pair of strong hands slid under his shoulders, lifting his upper body while his legs remained thrashing. They didn't whip for long before a stalwart grip wrangled the bindings at his ankles. He was lifted into the air and seconds later heard the squash of leather boots on congested soil. Toby could barely make out the older voice through his own muffled shrieks.
I hate visiting coachman.
It didn't matter if his captor was speaking to Toby or their partner. Toby wasn't concerned with what was said. All of his adrenaline, all of his fear was being poured into laboriously trying to break free, to remove himself from captivity, to not die. His body tingled from the blend of epinephrine and cortisol. Neither diluted each other, but rather merged to concoct something stronger. Toby's hysteria was an agonizing form of torture, with his bear's grip being unsusceptible to his protests.
Every time I lay eyes on that larva, makes me all Kagou.
Another word Toby recognized, roughly translated to just not feeling right, or a stricken spirit, which Toby definitely was. The younger voice spoke up.
You want the blind honor off?
Toby continued to scream and squirm against his captor's words as much as their hold. Abruptly, he felt 2 sharp slaps on his cheek and the voice continued.
Coachman's ugly, and it's gonna eat you slow.
Toby was completely consumed by his trepidation, almost causing him not to process the kindness being offered.
This lava saliva's gonna cause you to see horrors we can't. You're gonna hallucinate your worst nightmares. You want the blinder off?
Intense sobs washed over Toby as he slowly shook his head no. Regardless of being completely petrified of the nightmare waiting for him, not being able to see was the only comfort he had.
All right, Pa. Feet first.
Toby heard the older voice grunt, and felt the lower half of his body rise for his calves to be supported on the knot of a shoulder. Now that his voice was raw and his squalls were muted even further, he noticed an eerie creaking. The closest thing he could relate it to was the groaning of wet rope straining to hold taut. This sounded more visceral, almost sinewy. Was this Kochma? A gentle pat on his shin interrupted his thoughts, and the older voice spoke.
Coachman's drool should kick in soon. See you on the other side, Wody.
The hands under Toby's shoulders lifted his upper body level with his feet. Half a breath later, a powerful constricting latched around his boots. The word no consumed Toby's mind. It was wailing inside and outside of his head in a measured rhythm. After 5 counts, a severe burning enveloped the lower half of his legs. The hands under his shoulders were gone, leaving the top half of his body writhing, suspended in the air. Hallucinations devoured Toby's mind. Slowly, white hoods began to melt into his view. He was horrified, not by the clan before him, but by his own voice. He was screeching. Help! Toby reached a free arm out to one of the clan members, but the immobile lower half of his body was searing. With a panicked glance down, he saw flames devouring his legs adhered to a wooden post buried in burning wood and coals. The fire licked at his thighs as he noticed barbed wire wrapped around his waist, tethering him to the fiery post. With one hand madly yanking at the wire, Toby stretched the other out and pleaded to a hooded figure who had stepped forward. Please! As the blaze reached Toby's navel, the lead clansman slid off his hood to reveal a glossy alligator snout with ivory teeth exaggerating a hungry sneer. Toby was torn between fleeing the fire or the robe killer before him. He attempted to wave the predator away as he tugged at the barbs biting into his hips. In an unseen moment, the deadly snout snapped out, closed over Toby's forearm, and ripped a limb from its shoulder. Toby choked on a scream as blood sizzled into the fire. He studied the bleeding stump with wide eyes. Unable to heave out the cry lodged in his throat, he could only emit sounds reminiscent of a hiccup. Movement caught his eye, and he witnessed a wave of hoods slithering off, displaying a mob of sinister reptilian maws. Toby finally released a garbled howl as the crowd descended upon him, consuming all of his existence.